You've done this before. A water bottle sat in your car for 2 days. The cap was still on. Nothing was floating in it. Nothing smelled wrong. And you dumped it out anyway. No test. No love. No evidence that anything had changed. Just a feeling. And the feeling won. That reaction seems small. Almost silly. But it may be connected to one of the oldest problems humans ever had to solve. Because for most of our history, clean water did not come out of a tap. There were no filters. No chlorine. No sealed plastic bottles. No warning signs. No germ theory. There was just water. A river. A spring. A muddy pool. Rain trapped in a hollow. Whatever was nearby. And hidden inside some of it were organisms nobody could see, smell, or understand. So here's the question. How did ancient humans keep drinking untreated water for hundreds of thousands of years without constantly poisoning themselves? The first answer feels obvious. They probably chose the water that looked safest. Imagine a small group arriving somewhere unfamiliar. Everybody is thirsty. One pool is still, greenish, and smells slightly wrong. Another source is clearer and moving. Nobody needs a lecture. Nobody needs to know what a bacterium is. One looks wrong. The other looks better. And that kind of decision probably mattered. Humans are unusually good at noticing signs of contamination. Bad smells, rotting material, slime, cloudiness, dead animals. Anything that suggests decay can trigger an immediate step-back response before you consciously explain why. So maybe that's the answer. Ancient humans survived because they got good at avoiding obviously disgusting water. Simple, except it doesn't solve the real problem. Because some of the most dangerous water does not look dangerous at all. A stream can look perfectly clear and still contain pathogens. Something can taste fine and still make you violently sick later. You cannot reliably see your way out of invisible contamination. And now the mystery gets harder. If your senses can only warn you about the threats they can detect, what protected you from the ones they couldn't? Before answering that, there's one important correction. Ancient humans did not have some secret method that made unsafe water safe. They got sick. They had parasites. Children died. Adults died. People made bad decisions and paid for them. The survival of the species does not mean every individual was protected. That's easy to forget. The real question is not, how did humans avoid waterborne disease? They didn't. The better question is, how did they reduce the risk enough, often enough, to keep going? That answer seems to come from several different systems working together. And the first one was probably already inside the body. Psychologist Paul Rozin spent decades studying disgust, and later researchers such as Marshaller described part of this response as a behavioral immune system. The idea is simple. Your immune system fights threats after they enter the body. Disgust tries to keep some of those threats from entering in the first place. You smell something rotten and pull away. You see mold and hesitate. You watch somebody vomit and suddenly lose your appetite. None of that requires conscious reasoning. The avoidance comes first. The explanation comes later. For an animal without microscopes, that's useful. You don't need to know that decay can be associated with microbes. You just need a nervous system that makes decay feel like a bad idea. That system could steer people away from a lot of obvious danger. But now we hit the same wall again. Disgust is powerful, pathogen is not no smell. It cannot identify every parasite in clear water. It cannot tell you that someone upstream contaminated a stream an hour ago. So disgust helped. But disgust had a gigantic blind spot. What filled that gap? This is where the answer stops being purely biological. Humans do something most animals are much worse at. We copy each other. We remember. We warn. We pass information forward. A child does not have to discover every dangerous water source by getting sick personally. Someone else can point. Someone else can refuse to drink. Someone older can remember which spring still runs late in the dry season, which pool animals crowd around, which place made people sick last time, which route usually leads to better water. Nobody has to understand microbes for that information to become valuable. If one person learns something the hard way, the whole group can potentially inherit the lesson, not genetically, socially. That changes the problem completely. Because now survival is not just about what your senses can detect. It's also about what your group remembers. And that may be one of the most underrated technologies humans ever developed. Not a spear, not fire, shared memory. A warning can travel farther than a nose can smell. A habit can survive longer than the person who first discovered why it mattered. A taboo can preserve a useful rule even after nobody remembers the original reason for it. And once you see that, a strange possibility appears. Ancient humans may often have been protected by rules they could not explain. Avoid that pool. Drink from there. Don't touch that carcass. Don't stay near this water after the rains. Maybe some rules were wrong. Some almost certainly were. But a group does not need perfect to make survival slightly more likely. Still, even that is not the whole story. Because the environment ancient humans lived in was different from the environment that later made contaminated water one of civilization's great killers. For much of human prehistory, people lived in relatively small, mobile groups. That did not make them safe from infection. Far from it. But it changed the ecology of disease. A small group that moves does not create the same permanent concentration of human waste around one water source that a dense settlement can. There are fewer people continuously contaminating the same place. There are fewer opportunities for certain pathogens to circulate through huge populations. And when a local environment becomes depleted or unpleasant, a mobile group can leave. That matters, because one of the biggest turning points in the history of water was not when humans discovered some perfect natural source. It was when humans stopped moving. Agriculture changed the equation. Permanence c'est le Mongol. People lived closer together. Waste accumulated. Animals lived near humans. The same wells, rivers, and water sources could serve larger numbers of people for longer periods. Now contamination could build in ways a small moving band rarely produced at the same scale. The problem was no longer just which water looks bad. The problem became what happens when thousands of people keep using the same water system. And this is where human culture started building more complicated workarounds. Which brings us to beer. Not because beer explains how humans survived for hundreds of thousands of years. It doesn't. The evidence is far too late for that. But it shows something important about what humans eventually learned to do in what is now Israel. Archaeologist Lou and colleagues found residue in stone mortars consistent with the production of a fermented cereal-based drink roughly 13,000 years ago. The people associated with the site were Natufian hunter-gatherers. This was before full-scale agriculture in the usual sense. And the context appears to have been strongly connected to ritual and feasting. So we should be careful. There is no good reason to say they invented beer to purify water. That would go beyond the evidence. But fermentation does create a different microbial environment. Acidity changes. Alcohol can appear. The liquid becomes chemically different from untreated water. And that gives us another clue. Humans were learning to transform what they consumed long before they understood the invisible biology underneath it. Sometimes for taste. Sometimes for calories. Sometimes for ritual. Sometimes perhaps with side effects that reduce certain risks. The important point is not that beer saved humanity. It didn't. The important point is that culture kept discovering processes that changed exposure to danger before science could explain why. And that leads to an even stranger question. If instinct, shared knowledge, mobility, and cultural practices were already doing all this work, when did humans finally understand what was actually in the water? Shockingly late. In 19th century London, cholera could rip through a neighborhood with terrifying speed. People knew the disease was deadly. They did not yet agree on how it spread. Many still blamed bad air. Then, in 1854, physician John Snow studied a cholera outbreak around Broad Street. Instead of asking only what the victims had in common socially, he mapped where they lived. The deaths clustered around one public water pump. Contaminated water was transmitting the disease. The Broad Street pump became one of the most famous episodes in the history of epidemiology. And think about how bizarre that timeline is. Humans have been avoiding foul smells and suspicious food for an unimaginably long time. Groups have been passing down rules about where to eat, drink, camp, and travel. Civilizations had built wells, channels, fermentation traditions, and water handling practices. And only very recently did science finally identify the invisible world that made some of those habits useful. The reasoning came late. The behavior came first. But notice what happened after science arrived. Suddenly we could do something instinct never could. We could test water that looked perfectly clean. We could detect contamination with no smell. We could treat a source before anyone got sick. We could build systems designed around threats the human senses were never built to notice. That is the real difference between ancient survival and modern safety. Ancient humans had layers of imperfect protection. Your senses, your disgust response, your group's memory, your local habits, your mobility, your cultural practices. None of them were reliable enough on their own. Modern sanitation works because it does not depend on any of them. And yet the ancient systems never disappeared. Which brings us back to the bottle in your car. The water may be microbiologically fine. The cap may never have opened. A laboratory test might tell you there is nothing unusual about it. But your nervous system does not read laboratory reports. It sees old water. It sees heat. It sees a container that has been sitting somewhere too long. And somewhere underneath conscious thought, an old decision rule starts whispering the same thing it has whispered for generations at a public fountain. Maybe don't. You hesitate at a stranger's half-finished cup. You feel better when the cap cracks open for the first time. A sealed bottle feels safer before you know anything about the chemistry inside it. And that feeling is valuable enough that companies can sell it to you. Purified, mountain, fresh, sealed. The label is modern. The reassurance it gives you may not be. But there is an important twist here. Your ancient alarm system is not always right. That is exactly why science matters. A clear mountain stream can be risky. A treated municipal tap can be extremely safe. Your instincts were built to make fast guesses from visible clues. Modern water systems were built because visible clues are not enough. So the story is not that ancient instinct was secretly smarter than science. It wasn't. The story is that humans survived for a very long time using a stack of experience caught others. Culture remembered what individuals forgot. Small, mobile groups changed the disease environment. Later, new practices changed food and drink. And eventually science exposed the invisible part of the problem that instinct could never see. No single trick saved us. That is the surprising part. Human survival was not one brilliant solution. It was thousands of imperfect decisions, repeated, shared, corrected, and passed on. So next time that forgotten bottle in your car suddenly feels wrong, notice what is happening before you pour it out. Part of you is making a judgment with almost no information. That system is old, very old, but it is only one layer of the story. Your ancestors did not survive because they somehow knew which water was clean. They survived because senses, habits, other people, culture, movement, and eventually science kept catching different pieces of a problem no one system could solve alone. The feeling got there first, but it was never the whole answer. And 200,000 years later, that old feeling is still riding shotgun, making its guess before you've even finished asking whether the water is safe.